So, hello everybody, welcome back to Law Hero. We'll talk about social conformity, and we're going to frame it within the jurisprudence or legal framework or legal history or kind of legal philosophy. And the reason it's very important is we often apply laws and we know the rationale for laws, but a lot of the time it's very, very important to go a few steps back and understand social context of legislation, understand history, understand the politics. And that's what I always am going on about on this channel, is always to have a broad knowledge of many areas, and it will actually contribute to your judgment. Because what is intuition? Intuition is being able to recognize patterns. Actually, your stomach is doing it for you. It's the recognition of patterns from experience. And if you are able to recognize patterns across different industries, this will strengthen your judgment, i.e. your intuition. So today we're going to talk about social conformity, because not only has it been a hot topic during COVID, it directly links to lawmaking. And I want to kind of delve into a little bit of a history around conformism, which is its like philosophical or psychological branch of social psychology. And yeah, I want to talk about it because when it comes down to it, you have different strands of jurisprudence. For example, natural lawyers think that we act from an innate sense of morality, and that natural law is a God-given law that all humans have inside us because we were made in God's image. Then if you are somebody who believes in humanism, or so the like social contract, and so the complete different area of jurisprudence, you believe that you subscribe to living in a society because of the economic and social benefits you will get from it, and not because, so you're doing it because you're trying to gain value rather than avoid wrong. So we're going to try and square conformism with our knowledge of legal philosophy. And when I say conformism, for me, the big one, and this is because I probably studied in Erlangen and Nuremberg, and I also went to the courts in Nuremberg. For me, it was always about the Nazi trials and the people who were involved in those, that to me was the most extreme form of conformism, because you had people who were, came up in the tradition, especially from Bismarck, and even before that, you had a very strong military tradition and a very strong social contract, and a very much cooperative place to be. Like, if you think about it, public infrastructure, which basically originated in Germany, ever before there was any issues because of World War One. Like, for example, the Pfandbrief, which was a public debt, and the Pfandbrief was the instrument that was used to basically fund the high level of public infrastructure in Germany. They were very public-centered country, and even now today, for example, very high level of taxes, but you also have a very high payout in terms of health and education. It's very much a social state. So you would ask yourself, okay, if you have such a strong social background, how could it lead to the slaughtering of millions of people? Conformism can make people do things that are completely against their social, political, culture and economical leanings. In 1963, there was a behavioural study of obedience by somebody called Stanley Milgram. Now, he was from New York City. And he conducted a series of experiments that suggested that the majority of people are capable of causing extreme harm to others when they are told to do so by a figure of authority. And he also was fascinated by the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi criminal. And there was an interesting part in the study which suggested that certain groups of people, as in your culture and where you come from, can make you more obedient. And it was suggested in these studies, very, very interestingly, that German people had personality characteristics that made them susceptible to committing the atrocities of the Holocaust. And this was because in many of the Nazi war criminals' trials, they said time and time again, it was this sentence, "I was following orders," like as if there was no choice. And they saw it because you were ordered to do something, there was no choice. And if you think about rebellion and the countries who've experienced rebellion, particularly those who were colonized by the Great Britain, those countries didn't really have a tradition of following orders. For example, in Ireland here, during the Civil War, we had guerrilla warfare, which was actually a type of military strategy, which is ambush used against the Black and Tans. And that was seen as, so the argument I'm trying to make is that German people had never been under siege by a foreign invader, and perhaps this thousands of years of following orders is maybe a possible reason for the dogmatic following of orders during Nazi Germany. And I think it's very interesting, and you'll see why later. The study went on to demonstrate that important aspects of the relationship between authority and obedience, it remains one of the most controversial experiments. So basically he believed the situation and with World War II and the compulsion of the Germans to follow orders was what actually enabled Nazi Germany. The behaviour was a direct result of the situation, and any of us might have behaved identically in the same context. So basically, the person who authored this study said that actually no, if the authority is strong enough, any person is capable of following orders. And the reason is because human beings crave certainty from a leader. And this is a biological tendency that we have. It's actually survival instinct. And it was based around getting food during the time of hunter-gatherers. If you didn't follow the leader, you would be an outcast from the group and you would starve and die. So it's a very, very strong biological impulse that is very, very difficult to go against as an average human. So in the experiment, this Milgram, he set out to test whether normal, kind, likeable people could be made to act against their own moral values in a setting where some kind of authority held sway. He devised an investigation of how obedient a selection of ordinary men would be when they were told by an authority figure to administer electric shocks to another person. So it took place in 1961, and there was about 40 people involved. And they were from all different types of backgrounds, and they were paid the same amount to do the experiment. So they created a fake electric shock generator, and they had 30 switches on it. Each would increase by around 15 volts. So for every switch, it was going up in power. So you had from a slight shock on one end of the scale to an extreme intense shock or dangerous severe shock at the very, very end. So the person who was the experimenter or was the scientist was played by a biology teacher who introduced himself to the participants. To give the impression of authority, he put on a grey laboratory coat and maintained a stern and emotionless demeanour. The participants were told that the study intended to investigate the effects of punishment on learning. They were told that two of the volunteers would be the learner, the other would be the teacher. In fact, one of the two volunteers in each case was not a participant, but they was placed there. And it was usually a likeable person who was trained to play the role of the victim. So when this person and the genuine participant drew paper from a hat to determine which role they would play, the draw was always rigged so that this accountant took the role of the learner in every instant. So it was completely rigged. And then in full view of the participant, this person was strapped into the electric chair with electrodes attached to their wrist and was told that this is what would generate the shocks, but obviously this wasn't true. And then they put all the teachers, who were these people, into another room. So the people were told that although the shocks were painful, they would cause no long-term damage. And we all know that future discounting, which is the projection of present ideals to the future, is a very hard concept for human beings to understand. So we can conceptually imagine the future, but it's hard for us to understand the drawbacks and benefits of future events, i.e. events that have not yet happened. And to make the whole thing seem more authentic, they actually did shock him, but only with a baby shock. Okay. So then they got the teachers to read out a series of word pairs for the learner to memorize. And then obviously he had to read out a series of single words. And then the teacher had to, let me go back. So first of all, the teachers called out word pairs, and then the teachers called out single word, and then the learner had to recall the pairing word in each case and indicate their answer by pressing a switch that illuminated a light on the shock generator. If the answer was correct, you got to go to the next one, but if it was incorrect, the participant was instructed to tell the learner the correct answer, announce the level of shock they were about to receive, and then press the button. Participants were instructed to increase the shock level by 15 volts for every wrong answer. So as part of the experiment, the learner had been briefed to answer incorrectly to around 1 in every 4 questions to ensure that the shocks would be applied. During the experiment, the learner would pound the wall once the voltage had reached 300 and shout, "I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out." So throw his toys out of the pram. As shock level increased, he became more frantic, and then he stopped making any noise at all. Questions would be met with nothing but an eerie silence. The participant was told to treat any unanswered question as a shock. If he expressed misgivings about continuing the experiment, he received a verbal prod from the scientist to encourage him, from a simple request to continue to finally being told he had no choice but had to go on. If he refused to obey after the last prod, the experiment was terminated. So before the experiment was ever conducted, they had asked people out in the street, and then learned psychologists and psychiatrists their opinion. And most people thought participants would stop at any level that caused pain, and the psychiatrist predicted that at most only 1 in 100 would continue to the highest level of shock. Astonishingly, when the experiment took place, all 40 of the participants obeyed commands to administer the maximum level of volts. Only 5 people refused to continue. 65% obeyed the scientist right to the end, obeying his commands. Their discomfort at doing so was often evident. Many showed signs of severe distress, tension, nervousness over the course of the experiment. They stuttered, trembled, sweated, groaned, broke out into nervous laughing fits, and 3 people had full-blown seizures. In every instance of the experiment, the participants stopped and questioned it at some point. So, that is a good thing, that they actually did ask, do we have to do this? Some even offered to refund the money they were paid at the beginning. Interviews after the experiments confirmed that with only a few exceptions, participants had been completely convinced that the learning experiment was real, which was, what they really wanted. Oh, by the way, all this was conducted at the Yale University. All participants were fully debriefed so they understood what had actually happened, and they were asked a series of questions to test that they were not emotionally harmed by the experience. The participants were also reunited with the learner so that he could tell them that no real shocks had been administered. But we all know now that even though there was no harm done, we got a massive insight into the conformitous default nature of the human psyche. So let us go through them. The first one was that the participants were assured the shocks were painful but not dangerous. Okay, so remember they were told at the start that he would feel a small amount of pain, but it would cause no long-term damage. They were also paid to do the experiment, and we all know the law of reciprocity. If somebody gives you something, you feel obliged to carry out the obligation. Result of the experiment was that the authority figure was pivotal in all of this. So, you know, the man wearing the coat, being very emotionless and giving clear instruction to the participants, notwithstanding the extreme circumstances. It is clear from the reactions and responses of the participants that obeying the scientists did violate their own sense of morality and negatively affected them physically and emotionally, but the pressure to comply was simply too powerful to defy. This sense of obedience comes from the fact that people are socialized from a very young age by parents and teachers to follow orders from authority figures. Obedience is a basic element in the structure of social life. It serves numerous productive functions. But let's go back to our World War II example. You could not have had the result that World War II brought about without dogmatic obedience. And when you do not have the ability to go against everybody, like as in when the impact of you going against the rest of the crowd is negative, you even have less of an impetus to go with your own morality. So it is this conflict between a person's conscience and external authority creates a huge internal pressure. And by the way, actually, Milgram experienced an awful lot of backlash when he did his experiment. Now, he defended himself saying that if the participants had any inkling that it wasn't real, he wouldn't have got the true result, and I tend to agree with him. And I think his experiment was seminal, but also like the American Psychological Association, they revoked his membership. I think they were just panicking a bit that he was a bit radical, but sometimes you need people like this, you know, to push the boundaries in order to understand psychology better. Aside, I want to now come back to obedience, following orders, and obviously like orders, when I say orders I mean legislation, social cues, all that kind of stuff. That's what I'm really, really fascinated by. So the notion of a society resting on understanding that individuals are prepared to relinquish some personal autonomy and look to others of higher authority and social status to make decisions on a larger scale comes from a higher, broader perspective. And we know that this is true with the vaccines. So we are told as a public health as a public health mandate, we are advised to take the vaccine, and this is coming from a place of authority. There is no authority figure telling us not to get the vaccine, so bear that in mind. Even the most democratic of societies require the ruling of a recognised legitimate authority to take precedent over self-regulation in pursuit of the greater collective good. And even if you read the Irish Institution, even if you read the Irish Constitution, you know, we, the Irish people, we are a democratic state, but we look to Almighty God to lead us in our decisions. And so whether you call this external source, God or government, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you are relinquishing your autonomy, and the same was when you joined the EU, the same as when you join NATO. Anytime you join in some group, you relinquish your autonomy. In order for any society to function, its populace must agree its rules. Legitimacy is, of course, the key. There's countless historical examples of people using their authority to persuade others to commit crimes against humanity. The study showed that it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. And again, like, this reminds me of COVID, because during COVID you had a lot of uncertainty, and it would only be a very psychotic person who enjoys that level of chaos. So most people do not enjoy chaos. People enjoy certainty and routine, because we are very routine based animals. And that is why you have to forgive people for falling into line, because it goes against your nature, basically. And it would only be if many people were rejecting a vaccine, or many people were rebelling, that people would feel comfortable. But when the majority are getting vaccinated and the orders are coming from a higher authority, you are feeding into a greater good. It's not about you, it's about the collective, and that is the price you pay, just like your TV license, to become a member of a society. You're protected by society, but you will be ostracized by society for not complying. The takeaway from all of this is that conformity is not based on human characteristics. It's based around the circumstances in which we find ourselves in. And when you think back to, when, for example, homosexuality in Ireland was outlawed, which was pre-1991 Criminal Justice Act. If you look at the social context of the time, you had a very high level of AIDS, HIV/AIDS. You had the Catholic Church in Ireland with a strong grip on many people's decision making. So in the context of the time, it's quite understandable that an act which is expressly outlawed in the Bible would find a ban in legislation, especially in a country where the constitution is tied into the Catholic Church. It's not outside the realm of possibility. But when you have a country like Ireland who joined the European Union in 1973, we were blessed with fantastic infrastructure from the EU, but at the same time the EU paved the avenue for the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to privacy, which ultimately became the main argument of Senator David Norris when he went to try and nullify the law that outlawed homosexuality in Ireland. He didn't rely on any religious or moral arguments. He relied on a piece of law that was secondary to our local laws. So in the context, the pressure was on him to conform, but because of the circumstances, which was Ireland as itself had already given up some of its sovereignty to be a member of the EU, with that comes more freedoms for our people in line with other European traditions. But then at the same time, when it comes to, for example, European criminal law and sanctions, we have to follow what our European neighbours are doing, and we're not free, for example, to make our own decisions as regards foreign policy when it comes to issues of EU law. That's just an example, or the euro, which or contributing to the European Stability Mechanism after the last financial crash. If you remember, Pierce Doherty was involved in that. He thought, but this is the whole argument. It's when you give up some of your autonomy, you basically, there's benefits and there's pitfalls to that. So that is conformism in a nutshell, I think. I think it's very, very important to understand it as a lawyer. And the takeaway is that we don't look at people's characteristics, we look at the context in which they act. And as they call that in law, that is judging a situation on a case-by-case basis. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a long one, but I really, really wanted to cover it, not only for you guys, but for myself, because I really love issues of morality and ethics. So yeah, I'll see you all in the next one.